The year is 1177 BC. In the span of a single human lifetime, the world did not just change, it ended. Most people believe the Bronze Age collapsed because of a single, violent bad guy, the mysterious Sea Peoples, who allegedly burned their way through the Levant. But they are wrong. History has spent 3,000 years looking for a murderer, when it should have been performing an autopsy on a suicide. We see the frame now. 35-millimeter grain, the color of parched ochre. The camera pans across the ruins of Ugarit, a city that was the New York of its day. The light is harsh, golden, and unforgiving. In the dust, we find a tablet. It isn't a prayer or a poem. It's a desperate, unrefined plea for help that was never sent, because the kiln that was supposed to bake it was instead buried under the collapsing walls of the palace. My father, behold, the enemy's ships came. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. When we look at the maps of 1200 BC, we see a world that feels eerily familiar. This was the first global age. From the tin mines of Afghanistan to the copper pits of Cyprus, the veins of trade were pulsed by a complex, interdependent heart. The Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittites of Anatolia, the New Kingdom Egyptians, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians weren't just neighbors. They were a singular organism. They relied on one another for the very ingredients of their survival. To make bronze, the silicon chip of the era, you needed copper and tin. If the supply chain from the east broke, the swords of the west turned to soft, useless copper. I've stood in the trenches of Hattusa, the Hittite capital, feeling the tactical grit of desert sand beneath my fingernails. There is a specific, eerie silence in a place that died all at once. The curiosity gap here isn't if they fell, but how 5 distinct, hyper-stabilized empires, powers that had survived for centuries, could all experience a total systemic failure in less than 50 years. Imagine a row of dominoes where every piece is a superpower. We are taught that empires decline slowly over centuries of decadence. That is a comforting lie. The data from the Open Context Archives suggests something far more terrifying: the perfect storm. It wasn't one fire. It was a simultaneous arrival of drought, famine, internal rebellion, and seismic activity. A seismic paroxysm, where earthquakes rocked the Mediterranean like a ship in a gale. As the flickering light of a kerosene lamp illuminates the stratigraphy of the dig site, we see the ash layers. They are thick, black, and uniform across thousands of miles. This wasn't a localized riot. This was the moment the Great Silence began. The scribes stopped writing. The potters stopped spinning their wheels. The kings, once gods, were found face down in the mud of their own irrigation ditches. We are not just looking at the past. We are looking at a stress test for civilization itself. What happens when a system becomes so efficient that it loses its resilience? What happens when just-in-time logistics meets a never-before catastrophe? Now, let us peel back the layers of dust and resurrect the truth of this fallen world. To understand the anomaly of the Bronze Age, we must stop looking at the Sea Peoples as a cause and start seeing them as a symptom. For decades, archaeology relied on the great Medinet Habu inscriptions of Ramses III, high-contrast chiaroscuro shadows carved into stone, showing the pharaoh crushing a fleet of barbarians. It's a convenient narrative, the civilized world versus the wild horde. But when we examine the stratigraphic layers and the TDAR, the digital archaeological record, data, a different, more jagged truth emerges. The Sea Peoples weren't a unified invading army. They were refugees. They were the precariat of the 12th century BC, pushed out of their homes by the very same ecological collapse they are accused of causing. I call this the multiplier effect. When I analyze the pollen samples taken from the Sea of Galilee and the Orontes Valley, the data is undeniable. Between 1250 and 1100 BC, the Mediterranean entered a dry pulse that lasted for a century. This wasn't a bad summer. It was a multi-generational mega-drought. The 3-second pacing transitions of our cinematic lens show us the result. Scene A, a Hittite granary, empty, the floorboards polished by the feet of starving rats. Scene B, a Mycenaean palace where the linear B tablets record not epic poems, but frantic inventories of bronze scraps and meager oil rations. Scene C, the Nile, its levels dropping until the life-giving silt turns to cracked white clay. The anomaly lies in the hyper-cohesion. In a less connected world, the Hittites might have survived a drought by trading with the Greeks. But the Greeks were facing the same drought. The attribute of their decline was not a lack of strength, but an excess of connectivity. They were too big to fail, and therefore, they were guaranteed to fall. Consider the Minoan-Mycenaean fault. For years, we believed internal palace revolts destroyed the Greek citadels. But recent high-resolution mapping shows that the destruction levels at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Medea all date to the exact same window of a seismic storm, a cluster of massive earthquakes. The gods didn't just abandon these people. The very earth beneath their feet betrayed them. As a researcher, when I look at the opportunity score of this data, I see a pattern of systemic fragility. The empires had optimized their trade routes so perfectly that there was no buffer. There was no plan B. When the tin trade from the east was cut off by nomadic migrations, likely driven by that same drought, the military-industrial complex of the Bronze Age evaporated. The visuals here should be volumetric dust caught in the beams of a flashlight. In a collapsed tomb, we see the finery, the gold masks, the lapis lazuli lying in the dirt. Worthless, because you cannot eat gold. The myth-busting truth is this: the Bronze Age didn't end because of sea peoples, with feathered headdresses and bronze swords. It ended because of a commodity collapse. It was the first Great Depression. But instead of losing money, they lost the ability to maintain a complex society. The result was the total disintegration of the political fabric. In the space of 50 years, the literacy rate of the Mediterranean plummeted to near zero. Linear B vanished. The Hittite language died. The world went dark. And the silence lasted for nearly 400 years. The data-driven resolution of the perfect storm reveals a humbling human truth. Progress is not a one-way street. We often view history as a steady climb toward greater complexity. But the collapse of 1177 BC proves that complexity is a debt. that must be constantly repaid with resources. When the interest on that debt, the climate, the trade, the social stability becomes too high, the system goes bankrupt. The curiosity loop brings us back to our own reflection. We live in a world of high-grain, digital interconnectivity, where a blockage in a single canal or a dry spell in a single grain belt can send ripples across the planet. The Bronze Age rulers thought they had mastered the world. They had only mastered a specific, temporary set of conditions. The camera lingers on a final shot. A single, broken stirrup jar on a deserted beach. The warm tones of a setting sun catching the salt crystals on its rim. The empires are gone. The great silence remains. But in that silence, we find the blueprint for our own survival. We are only as strong as our ability to endure the storm when the lights of the global age begin to flicker. We must ask ourselves, if our tablets were buried today, what story would the ash tell the archaeologists of the future?